Good evening. My name is Rebecca Fox, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues. When we held Clark Forum events in person, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to Indigenous peoples for centuries prior to European settlement. Currently, in upstate New York, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawk peoples. I encourage everyone watching this program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional lands you inhabit. On behalf of Dickinson College and the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues, I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, From McDonald's to Google. In tonight's lecture, Kelsey Hightower, a principal engineer with Google, will discuss the path he took into the field of technology and how others can forge their own unique journeys. This program is sponsored by Dickinson College's Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues and co-sponsored by the Departments of Mathematics, Computer Science, and Biology, the Popel Shaw Center for Race and Ethnicity, the Inclusivity in STEM Planning Committee, and the Churchill Fund. It is also a part of the Clark Forum's Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series, a series which aims to understand the roles of leaders and citizens in these uncertain times. The internet has brought numerous new experiences for citizens, but one of the most useful technologies is the ability to learn anything. If I wanted to know how to change my tires or become fluent in Spanish or cook a gourmet dinner, all the information I need is right at my fingertips. The ability and ease of learning new skills online has even translated into career advancement. The field of software engineering has blossomed with opportunities created by the advent of open source software, such as Google's Kubernetes engine. Open or free software is software that anyone is legally allowed to adjust or manipulate. Software like Kubernetes creates a unique relationship between the computer engineer developers and users, as anyone with access to the internet can make suggestions or changes to best suit their needs. Kubernetes specifically is an open source program for managing, scaling, and automatically deploying computer applications. The innovation that arises from the collaboration inherent to free sourcing has contributed to technological breakthroughs around the world. Our speaker tonight, Kelsey Hightower, is a widely respected engineer in cloud computing. He has helped develop and refine many Google Cloud products, including Google's Kubernetes engine, Cloud Functions, and Apigees API Gateway. Hightower works with executives and developers to help them better understand and leverage Google technologies and platforms to grow their businesses. As a self-taught engineer without a college degree, his journey to his current position has been unique and inspirational. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation, so please type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. Please post questions only in the live chat feature, as this is not the space for exchanging personal opinions during the speaker's presentation. Now, I'm so pleased to present Kelsey Hightower. Thank you.
Hey, it's me. So I'm kind of excited to talk about, my journey from, McDonald's to Google. And there's a lot that happens in between. I know there's a lot of people watching this, whether you're in college starting your journey. There's a lot of people who also are switching careers. So maybe going from one career to another. When I got into tech, I was into mainly like sports and other things. And I didn't get into tech until the 11th grade. I know a lot of people start early, but that wasn't necessarily the case for me. When I got my first job, it was in fast food, like most of you all, or some of you all that are watching today. And so I was approached by a magazine called The Protocol, and the author there named Tom wanted to interview me to tell my story. And it's the first time I've ever seen someone capture my story from their lens. And it gave me a lot of time to reflect. What does it take for someone to succeed in this tech career? And to be honest, there's a lot of luck, but there's a lot of hard work that has to be put in place so you can get lucky. So today I want to talk a little bit about my journey, and hopefully we can inspire a few people to really embrace where their starting point is and don't give up. Even though this software engineering thing can be hard, I think there's a human aspect to it that if we realize that, we'll understand that our unique contributions are very welcome in the tech industry. So when people say, hey, how did you get into tech? When I was younger, I didn't see anyone that looked like me in technology. There was no one that I would consider a role model doing what we consider software engineering today. And so my first piece of technology, or at least my first exposure to technology, was my mother teaching herself how to touch type. Now, my mom was a seamstress. She worked in, a place where, you're just sewing things on demand, and that was her job. And what she wanted to do was, as a single mother at the time, she wanted to have a better career for her and her two kids. So for her, she found a job posting for the United States or US Customs. And part of the job interview was, how fast can you type? So she goes in to apply for the job, and she's like, what's fast? And she told me she went to like a YMCA. I'm probably 5 or 6 at the time. And she goes to the local YMCA and she checks out a book to teach herself how to touch type. And as a young kid, all I can hear is my mom learning how to type. Tap, tap, tap. She has that book in front of her, learning the home base. Over time, you can hear my mom getting much faster. Someone's getting better at this technology thing. Now, back then, typewriters were kind of something that was mainly used because not a lot of these places had computers across the board yet. And so my mom was able to come home one day with a new outfit on. This time she had a uniform on, and she found a way to leverage technology to get a much better job in life. And that would inspire my work ethic going forward. So my first job at 15 was in fast food. And the thing I learned most about fast food was there's a team effort required, even at a place like McDonald's, for that business to be successful. And luckily, I had a really good store manager who inspired me to learn all of the various positions. Now, a lot of people think and says, how does McDonald's have anything to do with tech? Well, it turns out there's a work ethic that's required to be any good at this tech thing. And that work ethic can be acquired pretty much at any job. Learning new technology or learning how to do something and being good at it and learning to be a professional, I think are key elements that I use to help me succeed. I'm going to share my screen really quick to think about a concept that I consider, if you've never seen this movie called Hidden Figures, it plays a big role in terms of the people around us who influence us, but typically are hidden. So if we were to take a look at this scene from the movie, Taraji P. Henson is representing Katherine Johnson. So this is a mathematician over at NASA, and they're trying to figure out this new problem for the first time. And it turned out all of these people in this room have been struggling, NASA's best, on how to get humans into space and bring them back again. For them, this is a new problem. But it turns out there's an old solution to this problem. And Katherine Johnson was able to jump on that whiteboard and show them the formula to this. And when I first got into tech, I entered many rooms that looked just like this one. You're the only person who looks like you. And you ask yourself, do you belong? Now, a lot of times you can be intimidated by the audience around you, but eventually you can come into your own and show what's unique about you. And for her, she had a unique ability to understand these complex problems. And here, this is a case where she stepped up and was able to show leadership and show just how bright she was. And look at all the people around her. Their full attention is on the problem at hand. And this reminded me of tech being like this superpower. When you have the skills, whether it's software engineering or building hardware, these set of skills felt like a superpower to me. It felt like I can walk into any room and gather the respect of anyone as long as I could solve those problems. Also from that movie is another character. This is Dorothy Vaughan. That role is played by Octavia Spencer. And what's interesting about her role, and back then they called them the human computers. And what's interesting about her role is she had a job somewhat like my mom's. These are people brought in, and in this case, she was calculating things. And her team of human computers, she was the leader of that team. And here's the tough thing about technology. It keeps on changing. So there are a lot of people who are in school right now, learning the latest and greatest of technology. But in a couple of years, there will be something new that may come by and replace it. while the fundamentals be roughly the same, it could feel like you're out of place. In her world, the IBM was introducing the mainframe. This is the IBM 7090. And basically, IBM was taunting that this system could essentially replace all of her engineers and all the unique attributes they brought to the job. Now, several times in my career, I felt like this as well. Just when you think you got good at something, it seems like something new shows up and you have to start all over again. But one thing that's demonstrated in that movie that I think is super helpful in life is that you have a couple of choices. It turns out for 30 to 40 years, people have been thinking computers would replace many of these human jobs that are held. Now, there's been a lot of automation over that time, but it turns out humans are still in control. So she did something unique and something that I find myself doing constantly. She went and she taught herself Fortran. Now, this is one of the first programming languages, so I don't expect many of you to be learning about this thing right now. But what's interesting about this was she didn't wait for her job to send her to training. In fact, her job was considering replacing her and her team. And so when we talk about self-taught engineers, you hear that phrase thrown around a lot. Maybe you're in college right now saying, if there's so many great self-taught engineers out there, what am I doing here in college? The truth is, everyone learns in a different way. Even though I claim to be self-taught, the truth is the authors of books like this one are just the teachers I never met. I don't think any of us are really self-taught. I think there's a thing called like community learning. And colleges represent another style of community learning. You have professors and people around you that you can collaborate. And in many cases, it can accelerate your learning. But the truth is, even when you graduate, you'll be learning for the rest of your tech career. The good thing about this, though, is there are people who may be a flight attendant, maybe you work at the post office, maybe you have some other related field altogether. The nice thing about tech is you can jump in whenever you want. So when I was transitioning out of McDonald's, it turned out that I was able to just go to a local bookstore. They had those things back in my day. And at the local bookstore, I remember paying like $30 for a book on this open source operating system called Linux. And Windows was the most dominant operating system at that time. And so for me to go into the store and say, hey, I've seen some job postings that mention this word Linux. I have no idea what it is. So I bought the book. And I remember sitting on my mom's floor at the time, just flipping through the pages, trying to educate myself and say, hey, if I learn this, then maybe I'll acquire the skills for one of those jobs. Now, the other thing that makes her story special is that not only did she educate herself and bring herself up to speed, she also went back and taught the rest of her team. Now, this is a unique aspect in software engineering that I think people learn way too late. You're going to get pretty far with your individual skills and abilities. But what the software industry needs are team players. Luckily for me, when I was in high school, I played a lot of sports, basketball and football. And in those sports, there's no way you're going to win a game by yourself. There's other team activities that can influence how you develop as a person. And so for this team, they were able to overcome some of those obstacles. And it turns out that those machines that IBM brought in, well, they needed programmers to program them and tell those machines what to do. And that's what they eventually ended up doing. So they took what kind of seemed like a very daunting situation, educated themselves, and they stayed one step ahead of the machines. In fact, they controlled them. When I got my first job in tech, I was actually afraid to apply for my first job. I went the IT certification route. I never finished college. I think I probably went for a couple of weeks. And maybe my head wasn't in the right spot, or maybe I lacked the discipline to actually complete the coursework, but there was still work to do. So I went the IT certification path. Even if you get a college degree, this can be a great way to augment your own education. And I remember studying for the A+ certification. And what that is there's a industry standard, or CompTIA, an industry body, who goes out and tries to figure out what skills are necessary and then create a certification program with them. So I bought another book and started studying for that certification. And when you go take the test for these certifications, they put you in this little room. And inside of that room, they start the clock. You have about an hour. And you log onto the machine. And then there's this multiple choice question that pops up. And they're asking me all these things about how hardware works and how do operating systems play together, just to make sure you really learn the material. And when you hit that last answer, you kind of wait in silence, and you can look around the room and you can see the cameras pointed at you. That's how they make sure you're not cheating. I remember hitting submit, and back then, everything was connected to the internet, even over dial-up. Some of you may not know what that is when we try to get on the internet over our phone lines. And I remember my score coming back. I think I got like a perfect score. So now I had this IT certification in hand. But what did it mean? When I went to go look at all the job postings, it felt like I was always a few skills short. Where was I going to get 5 years of experience in this or that? So I went the other route. Looking back, it was probably way more risky. Instead of applying for one of those shiny jobs that you find on those online postings or maybe in a classified ad, I decided to start my own small business. I would be the hiring manager. There's no way I wouldn't hire myself. And if I didn't, that would be a problem, and maybe I need to rethink things. And so I opened a very small computer store right outside of Atlanta. This is where I grew up in those high school years. And I remember opening that computer store, and we would do things like build custom PCs. Now people just order them online, or we would make service calls. So after a lightning storm, everyone's modem would die in their computer and our phones would start ringing. And we already knew what was going on. So we would pack our cars with these little 56K modems, drive to people's house and say, let me guess, your internet is out. And we did that. And I did that for a couple of years, managed to hire a couple of my friends, but I was able to actually get the confidence necessary to apply for my first job. Now, here's the thing. This was my first time at Google. I joined Google as a system administrator. I had acquired enough skills at that point, but I didn't stay very long. That was my first real tech job, and it only lasted 3 months. And it wasn't because I wasn't any good. It was because I wasn't satisfied. See, earlier in my career, I kind of knew that I would have to bounce around quite a bit if I really wanted to be able to taste different parts of the industry. So I went from places like Google to web hosting, to financial services, to companies doing voice over IP. I tried a lot of things and I learned a lot of things. And all of that experience started to accumulate. In many ways, that was my college course. I was just taking all kinds of electives. And then one day I decided to slow things down a bit. And I settled in financial services. And this is where a lot of my maturity came in. See, when I first started, it was all about the technology. Everyone starts to identify themselves with their job titles. I'm a Linux system administrator. I'm a JavaScript programmer. And there's nothing wrong with that later on, but eventually you start to understand that when you can bring your whole person, your whole self to the job, it changes things. Eventually, you're going to run into situations where you're going to have to figure out how to take some new ideas or new technology and convince a bunch of other people that they should be used. And most new technologies are not going to be super stable. So there's going to be an element of building trust. The other thing I did for my career to really accelerate things was I started to contribute to the community and this open source world. And the way it works is typically my entry into tech was powered by open source. Earlier, they described open source as this concept of a lot of people working together for a common good. We just output software as a result. Maybe the phone in your pocket is running some open source software. But the nice thing about them, these communities are global. They're almost everywhere. And I decided to start giving talks at the local meetup. And what was interesting about giving talks, I remember watching Warren Buffett talk about all of his achievements in life. This is a multi-billionaire. He's graduated from some really nice colleges. And he said one of the things he was most proud of was his speaking certificate. He took a course on public speaking. Maybe it was a couple of weeks long. And he hangs that certificate on this wall because he said once he learned how to communicate his ideas, things took off for him. So I go to that local meetup. And I remember sitting there, it was at Georgia Tech in the heart of Atlanta. And I'm sitting in the audience and I'm watching these speakers come up and start sharing what they are learning about technology. And most of them appeared to be expert in the field. Be honest, I couldn't tell the difference. They could have been saying anything. And I remember after a couple of meetings, I raised my hand to volunteer that I would speak at the next meeting. Now, there's a big thing in the tech industry, and some people call it imposter syndrome. And there's this idea that there's an expectation that you must be an expert all the time in front of everyone. And that's a lot of pressure. One thing that I learned was learning in public is okay. And when you're willing to learn into public, you don't always have to be an expert. Your curiosity and your ability to find answers is also a skill. And a lot of people miss that particular component. So we shy away from engaging in discussions or getting involved in tech communities because we don't believe that we're an expert yet. So what I decided to do was copy what they did. I tried to become an expert as fast as possible and speak in expert terms. And I'm pretty sure that talk went okay, but that wasn't who I am. Who the person I am is I try to figure out what problems that I'm faced with and talk about the approaches, and through storytelling. That was my natural voice. So eventually I dropped the slides. I started to talk with my normal vernacular. I was always afraid to appear not looking like the in crowd. But eventually, like Katherine Johnson, I stepped up and showed people my true self. And that was a big game changer for me because now, instead of this person who works at Company X, I think I started to become the person who I am today. And now I get invited to speak at a lot of keynotes around very deep technical concepts. And my goal now is to weave stories to make these technical concepts way more human. And the reason why I have these stories is because I know what technology can do for people. Before I had that job in Atlanta, I remember making a house call. And I would pull up in that driveway and I would turn down my music because I didn't want to scare the homeowners. And I remember getting out of my car and I had my tool bag with me. And I was doing contract work as part of that business for Bell South or something like that. This is when high-speed internet was first coming out. And if you were lucky enough to get an appointment, you had about a 6-month window. If I showed up and you weren't there, you get to the back of the line, and it's going to probably be another 6 months before you get your opportunity to get high-speed internet. And I pull up to this house. It's amazing. The owner walks outside and meets me halfway between the driveway and his door. And he looked at me kind of strange. He asked who I was, and I said, "Hey, I'm here to install your high-speed internet. And this involves going into someone's home, opening up the computer, installing the special hardware, and making sure everything is hooked up." Then he let me know that, to be honest, a Black person had never been in his house. Now, this is 2002. And I'm figured we should be past that by now. But it turns out we weren't. And so he overcame that particular speed bump and he let me into the house. And as we're walking through, I remember looking on the wall and I saw him with photos of previous presidents. Turns out this person is an architect who helped design cities like Atlanta and Washington, D.C. And a part of those presidential administrations, he was able to take photos with a lot of the people he partnered with to design those things. So as we're walking to his computer, he's silent and he's asking himself in his head, does this person really know what they're doing? And at this point, I'm trying to show off. I'm trying to make the best impression because I know that I have a superpower and he needs help. And so I opened up his computer. I'm nice and patient. I'm explaining every step as masterfully as I can. I put the computer back together. And then I asked him to click on this browser. Bam, the internet is up. But this time, faster than ever. The smile on his face is amazing. And just to show off just a little bit more, I noticed that he had one of those fancy office printers in his home. You know, the kind with the fax machine, the scanner, the whole nine, all in one. And I noticed that he had to keep it really close to his computer because he was using one of those big, thick printer cables that you couldn't move more than 2 or 3 feet. But I noticed on the back of that fancy multi-purpose fax print machine is that it had a network cable. Now, he didn't have a small network in his home yet, so I figured I'd offer him, say, wouldn't it be nice if you can move this printer off your desk and put it behind you? And he was like, how would you do that? I was like, well, what you can do is we can create a small network right here and make it work. So I remember rolling out some cable, and I created my own Cat5 cable. That was the thing we did back then. And I hooked it up to a little switch and gave him the ability to print over the network. And I remember him asking, where'd you learn all of this? And I told him my story about getting A+ certified and that whole self-taught adventure. But the thing also that I learned that day is maybe this person had a bit of bias. But I watched that person change in real time. This tech thing has the potential to change the way people think about things, especially when you go and solve problems from them. It's been a big equalizer for me. Now that I have these skills and people know it, I can walk into many rooms with a lot of respect. There's a cliche that happens in our industry. People will say that this tech journey is like a marathon. And when everyone hears that, they see themselves as a marathon runner. And they believe that it's a race. And they try to run as fast as they can. And the thing about that, though, is if you do that and you're not careful, like most runners, you're going to burn yourself out. And that's a big problem in the tech industry. There's lots of ideas, there's lots of tools. It can be overwhelming at times. And a lot of people I see, they come into this industry head first. They don't set a good pace for themselves. And also, they believe that they're the only person racing. This is Eliud Kipchoge. Eliud Kipchoge may be regarded as the best marathon runner in history. And by himself, he was almost guaranteed to win any full marathon by a long shot. There's one thing he couldn't do by himself, though, and that was run a marathon under 2 hours. Most people thought that this is not possible for, even the best marathon runner in the world. Running a full marathon under 2 hours, not possible, they said. Well, if you look at this photo, this is Eliud Kipchoge crossing the finish line. And you'll say, well, how did he do it? How did he do it? That's a common question I get asked. How'd you do it? What makes you special? What did you do so different than everyone else? If you ask Nike, they'll say it's got to be the shoes. I don't know about y'all, but I've never seen anybody walking around with those Eliud Kipchoge's on. There's usually a different reason. And the way this worked was him running a marathon under normal conditions by himself probably was never going to get him to running a marathon under 2 hours. He's also getting up there in age, so maybe he's not as fast as he used to be, but he's still pretty high performance. It turns out he needed a little help. What you're looking at here is some other world-class marathoners. These folks are also good in their own right. What you're looking at is a peloton formation. They're lined, all 8 of these runners, in a perfect formation to help take the drag off of him. And they also set the pace. There's actually 30 of them there. And they all come in and out to keep fresh legs, to give him a pace that he's never had before. See, he's always in the front, all by himself. No one to his left, no one to his right, no one to push him but himself. In this image, you can see now that he's surrounded by the very best. And the very best are taking turns in and out to help him keep the pace. Now he's doing something he's never done before. He's on pace to run a marathon in less than 2 hours. Those aren't the only supporters in his life. There are people around you. Maybe they're your mom, your aunt, a close friend. These are the people who are at the other side of that finish line, whether you're in first place or you come in last. That's your support system. When you think about getting into tech, everyone says you got to learn to program or be a developer. There's way more roles than that. But also, if you really, really want to be good at this tech thing, you got to think about being a better person. And being a better person means surrounding yourself by people who can help you get to where you need to be. Or sometimes, just sometimes, it'll be your job to help someone get and achieve new heights. Recognize the various roles that are available to you. I'm back at Google again. I joined the company 5 years ago. I went from my first job, my first tech job, being at Google, to coming back again as a whole new person. I was now a respected industry figure. I had finally written a book just like the one that I read when I was first starting. And I remember during one of my keynotes, I just turned 40 a couple of days ago. In a couple of years, I decided that I wanted to hang it all up. I'm out of tech now. I want to be out of it. These keynotes and flying across the world and giving these talks, that's a lot of pressure. And so maybe I should stop. And I remember I was probably in London in a crowd of maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people. And I just did a really great keynote and I felt good about it. And I'm walking off the stage and saying to myself, well, that's it. There's nothing more to do here. And I remember if you've ever been to a tech conference, once the main track sessions let out, there's typically kind of a gathering area. We call it the hallway track in tech. And this is when all the technologists, we just kind of geek out in this circle and we start talking about the latest and greatest in technology. And we form these little circles. And that circle kind of represents everyone participating in the discussion. And I remember there was a guy from the audience. He walked up to the circle. Now, what you do when you're in one of these circles and someone new shows up, you kind of part the circle, letting them know that they're invited in. And so we're all looking at each other at eye level. Now, at this point, I'm the expert. Kubernetes had been out for maybe 2 or 3 years at this time. My book is now published on the subject. And so most people would approach me at these conferences to ask me some technical question about this thing we call Kubernetes. I'm always ready for those. So it was his turn. He steps into the circle and he looks at me, but this time he's much calmer than most. But his voice has a small crack in it. And he goes to ask his question. Now my mind is thinking, what Kubernetes questions is he going to spring on me now? But he didn't ask anything about the tech. He wanted to know about the person. And he looked at me and he asked, how are you able to perform so well when you're the only person that looks like you in the room? I looked around the circle, and just like Katherine Johnson on that ladder, I was the only person that looked like me in the room. But here was a person in front of me who looked like me and was asking, how does that work? I never thought about it. And before I could really give a great answer, I remember he had a follow-up. And he said that he never knew he needed a mentor until he watched one of my videos on YouTube. And I don't know if it was the allergies or not, but a lot of us started to tear up just a little bit. You see, at this point, I've never seen many people be very vulnerable at a tech conference. It's one of those places where you walk around as if you know everything. You remember that imposter syndrome thing again. And it turns out that people who walk around like that, they're the only imposters. You can recognize that you don't know everything and start a conversation so you can learn a little bit more. But the interesting thing about that encounter, it wasn't just him. As our eyes went from his eyes and looked down a couple of feet, we saw that he brought his son to the event as well. And he said, I want you to meet my son. And he extended his hand. And I shook it. And he said, I wanted to bring my son to the conference because I wanted him to know that not only could we attend the conference, we can lead them. And that let me know that this whole technology thing, what it does for people's lives, these are good tech paying jobs that we can use to support our families. There's a set of skills that equal the playing field, regardless of what your background is. People tend to respect people who can solve problems, especially problems that they can't solve themselves. So I never threw in the towel. I kept at it. Now I still give those talks and I still design great products over at Google, but I'm reminded that I always need to bring my whole person to the job. We're not just engineers, we're people who happen to do engineering. And with that, it's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hightower. We have some time for a couple of questions. The first one is from an audience member who is wondering what programs can be brought into high schools to help students navigate this path. What resources do you think would be the greatest help?
My wife's been in education for a long time. Her whole career has been in education. She's now at the director level in our local school system here in Washington State. And I'm one of those people who would always volunteer to go to the high school and talk to the kids, perform some cool activity to introduce some new technology. And one thing that I wish they had in high school was an ongoing set of things to build and maintain. While we can teach kids programming, the truth is a lot of it is super boring. It's like teaching people how to hammer nails into wood without showing them the house to build. So in high school, I think it would be nice. Like I remember there was like an auto shop class where there would be cars that were in need of service. And so kids had a real attainable project to give them motivation to learn things. So I think in high school, imagine the high school kids maintaining the school website, the high school kids building software to record the times at the track meet for the students. Maybe even the kids at the high school building software that can be used at the district level, helping reduce costs. And then maybe even open sourcing that software so that those high school kids could collaborate with other high school kids across the world. That will prepare them to actually work in the real world. That's exactly what we do day to day. We find organizational problems, we gather together, we build these solutions, and if we're lucky enough, we also get to open source that work so others can build on the momentum we had. I wish that existed in high school, because if it did, that would have been how I got my start.
That's a great response. Thank you. The next audience member asked, what are the best practices for embedding tech competence and creativity in non-science disciplines? Which, as an art major, I always appreciate hearing.
And when you think about it, technology is all around us, right? And so when we think about it, it's just a tool. So I have a friend, my best friend, actually, his wife is a comic book artist. And so for her, she prefers, or she used to prefer, just give me my paper, my pencil, I'll do my sketches. And she had a process. That's how it worked. But eventually you get to a point where that doesn't scale, especially if you're trying to produce like a weekly or daily comic, right? Like you need a better workflow than trying to do all of this work. And it turns out there are other artists who have been doing this for a while that have taken a lot of their expertise and they put it in the software. Now, if you take an artist and you give them an iPad and tell them to draw, the way we used to do, like, oh, this doesn't even have the physical response to know if I'm applying enough pressure to the pen or not. This isn't working for me. I don't want to adjust my workflow too much. And then what happens over time, companies like Adobe and Apple, they'll have artists on staff to say, what do we need to get right in the digital world to match the workflows that people have in the analog or real world? And then what happens is, an artist, what you want to do is you want to have a workflow that goes from the thing in your mind to the thing that people can see or touch. That's the automation component. So now when you look at this is when you embed these, you ask yourself, what's the workflow? So for an artist, the workflow may be having something like an Apple Pencil and an iPad with a thin sheet of, there's these pieces of covers that you can put on that will give you that same resistance that paper does. And then what you can do is your brain is now back into something that it understands. It feels like a pencil. It feels like paper. But then what you inherit is the software that can do things like save your work, create versions of your work. Maybe you think it's done, but you want to add something to it without losing the previous idea. And those are things that I think when technology gets embedded, it becomes part of your workflow. You can do this for every discipline. When my wife was in the building as a vice principal, I remember when she was doing those, she worked at a school where the mascot was an eagle, and she would print out these eagle awards. And one night I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And they were basically copying students' names and their GPAs and put it into this template one by one. There's hundreds of students at the school. I'm like, how long is this going to take? It's like, oh no, don't worry. All of us split up the work and we'll be done in a week. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. There has to be a better way. So it turns out they were using Google Slides to create these little templates that they would use. And I said, all right, I got it. What I'll do is you tell me where the student data is, put it in a spreadsheet, first name, last name, GPA. That's all I need from you. Then let's take that slide deck and we'll just make one slide. We'll call it our template. And it turns out that I can actually use some code to go to that spreadsheet, extract the data one field at a time. And then I can go to the slide deck and use the API to create another slide, but pre-populate the name and the GPA. So once I had the program written, it took me an hour or two. I told my wife, go back to work and make a deal. Say, I'll do all of the awards myself if you all take over the other work. And people was like, yeah, deal. So once I had the code done, I ran the little command and we could just generate all the awards in 5 seconds. She was like, this is sweet. I was like, yes, this is your superpower. You still need to know what needs to happen. We still need the data, but then we can automate your expertise, or at least the boring parts, with tools like this. So that's how you integrate into any workflow. Doesn't matter what job you're doing, you're really trying to automate expertise and build tools to augment what humans do, not replace them.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Our next question is asking, what advice would you give to students who are interested in engaging in open source software communities?
So one thing to caution yourself is like the wild, wild west. You know what I mean? Like if you go, it's like on your first day of school, you don't really know anyone. Other people seem to know what they're doing, but you don't. And in that kind of environment, there will be people, the teachers or the administration staff, who understand that their role is to help new students get on board. So you have to go seek out who those people are. We call them maintainers in the open source world. And those maintainers, if you were to walk up to a tool like GitHub is kind of like the new school. And on GitHub, what you'll find is all of these open source projects. Now, the question will be, well, which one do you pick? Well, the truth is that's really hard if you don't really have a problem you're trying to solve, because then you won't understand or have the motivation to work through the contribution process. But let's have a scenario. Let's say you found some software that, I don't know, some calculator software. And turns out for your work, you needed to do some other type of calculation, but it doesn't support it yet. So you found this open source calculator and you go to the community and you say, hey, I downloaded this software that turns out that it's open source and they're accepting contributions, but I have a problem. First, it was really, really hard to use when I first got started. So your first contribution can easily be writing better documentation so the next person can actually have a much easier time. And that's a good way to learn the contribution process. Sometimes there's copyrights involved, there's licensing of the software that's involved. All of these things are a little bit of boilerplate that you have to do to start contributing. But what we'll do is allow you to do something that the project needs. It's a safe way to kind of get started without necessarily breaking everything. And it's a good way to build relationships with the people who maintain the project. So now you got your first contribution in play. Go on Twitter and celebrate. Maybe you dance around the room because now you're an open source contributor. And so now you can start to think about that new functionality that you want to add. Now, your first contribution, especially on code that's someone else written, is going to be super, super hard. They have their own style, they have their own way of doing things, and it's going to take a while for you to kind of read up on what they're doing. You can ask questions. And then once you get to the point where you can start to experiment to try to solve the problem yourself, be patient and be clear in what your intentions are. So that's the way I would go about it. Try to find something that you are willing to use. And if you have a problem or you want to see a new feature, that's the thing that's going to motivate you to go through the full process necessary to get your contributions accepted.
Great. The next question is, what advice would you give to engineers to overcome imposter syndrome and burnout while remaining productive and happy?
I didn't have this advice when I started. So I got close to burnout and was unhappy multiple times. And so even though I'll give you these words, sometimes experience is like the only thing that can teach you. But here's one thing. Everyone is still learning. Kubernetes came out when I was 32 years old. That's when it came out. It didn't exist before then. So no matter when people got into the field or not, there's always something new to learn. So what I eventually did was start embracing the fact that you're going to learn forever. And so there's a set of fundamentals, and this is where I think you should gain your confidence. Let's say you get your first programming job, and that company uses the PHP programming language. It's a popular language, but it's not necessarily the ones people brag about. Even though tools like Facebook are written in PHP, not a lot of people are super happy or excited about PHP. But here's the thing. The fundamentals of programming, you're going to learn those in that particular language. And what you have to do is start to get comfortable learning the fundamentals. So for example, you may learn how to write your first Hello World application. Well, there's a lot of fundamentals there. There's the basic syntax. There's the basic getting it to run, deploying it, the whole nine. Now your confidence level should just itch a little higher because guess what? That is fundamentally the same process for the other programming languages like Java and C++. When we forget that the fundamentals are shared, we start thinking that, oh, there's so much to learn without acknowledging that we've learned so much already. The next thing is if you can gain that little bit of confidence, and every day or every week or every month, you'll learn something new. And I guarantee you, if you study the fundamentals behind the thing you've learned, it will apply in other places. Now, that confidence is key. It's okay when asked or faced with a new problem to say, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. If the answer was that easy to find, you probably wouldn't be coming to me. Your job isn't to have all the answers. Your job is to find the answers or experiment until they show up. And so, given that's the real job, you should always feel comfortable not knowing the answer. In my field, I'll be honest, I've been doing this for a long time. I still search the web for the majority of the things. I don't sit around and remember all the things anymore. Sometimes I'll even do a search and find my own blog post about how to do it. So I'm even teaching myself from the past in the future. Just embrace that. Do not pretend or treat yourself as someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Almost no one knows what they're doing. So embrace the fact that you'll be learning forever and give yourself credit for the things you've already learned.
That's a great response. The next question is, how long do you believe it will take for the software industry to be egalitarian for all cultures and genders?
See, that one's tough because, there's so many social economic factors that go into technology. If you go to a region that doesn't have stable power, it's going to be hard for them to participate in things that require a lot of power. Internet, a lot of things are assuming that you have connectivity. Like, think about the forum we're in. We're assuming all participants will have a stable and pretty decent internet connection. But one thing that is true, though, is that there's a lot of software. This idea of open source, I think, is the first step towards that. Number one, before we can get there, we need to have knowledge be accessible. So a lot of the tools we use, whether it's the tools we use to write the code, the tools we use to study and read the code, the tools we use to share the code, most of those things fall in the free and open source software. So even though they don't come with a price tag, they still have a price of admission of knowledge. And the good news, though, is that a lot of our knowledge is available on the web, assuming you have internet access. In a lot of countries, though, there are now what we call like lightweight versions of these apps that can run on a mobile device. I've actually met programmers who do software development on an iPad or a cheap iPhone. So now that we're having people have these supercomputers in their pockets, the price of creating software has dropped dramatically. Access to the best tools and libraries typically are free. So I think the biggest thing is that we have to accelerate and close that knowledge gap. Make sure people know where these tools are, how to participate, because those gates are actually pretty low. We don't have a lot of credentialing in our field. You don't need a PhD to become a software engineer, and don't let anyone tell you different. And what happens with that is when you have that kind of environment, then it's on those kind of local systems, whether it's the government or some foundation, when you can go and give people tools like even a Chromebook. It's funny, I do all of my software development on the equivalent of a $300 Chromebook, even though I have access to a multi-$1,000 machine. It just runs Linux and it works well for my workflow. And I can ship software that's used by people all over the world. So the barrier to entry is super low. When will it happen? When will we feel it? Well, I think we're going to be a long way because of all the geopolitical issues involved. But for the countries that have taken that step, it's amazing how they go from not participating at all to getting stable electricity and internet service to being some of the people who produce some of the best software in the world. Look at China, look at parts of Africa. There's a huge AI and ML movement in Africa because once they set up their infrastructure, it turned out they had a ton of talent that was really good at this. So internet democratized the infrastructure, and then you'll equal the playing field.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is, what are some tips you may have for dealing with the challenges of presenting when you're the only person in the room that looks like you?
This is tough because in my career, the majority of my career, that has been the case. And before I had the confidence, you always ask, am I supposed to be here? You can't help it. Am I supposed to be here? And if no one tells you you're supposed to be here, it's very easy for you to convince yourself that you're not. I've chaired a lot of conferences, and when we look at the speaker proposals, we won't see the underrepresented people even submit their own talks. And that just makes the problem continue. And when you ask that, I remember myself, a seasoned speaker, and I don't often need to submit a proposal these days. I'm lucky in that regard. Some people may reach out to me, but one day I remember after many years, I submitted a proposal for a local event. And I remember looking through the previous years of speakers to see who's spoken there before. And I remember seeing no one that looked like me. And the first thing you ask is, should I even waste my time submitting this? Because based on what I'm seeing, no one like me has ever been accepted. You don't know all the things under the covers. So I would say it's so important for everyone, no matter what your background is, to show up and participate to the best of your abilities. And I know that's asking a lot when you have to carry that additional baggage in order to participate. But like that one conference where I actually did the keynote and he was able to see me there gave him the confidence. Many years later, I actually met the CEO of his company, and he walked up and said, "You don't know me, but I really want to tell you thank you for what you did for that person." He came back with this new sense of confidence. His work went through the roof. I just want to say, I appreciate you were able to do something for him that I wasn't. So one thing we have to do is just make sure we're no longer the only people in the room. So if you see a local meetup, you see a local conference, or hell, an international one, you going will help someone else not be the only person in the room. And when you get there, and it took me a long time to do this, is go say hi to the other person and say, "Hey, normally I'm the only person in a room that looks like me. You want to hang out?" And that way we start to build these communities. And the last thing I'm gonna say here, I remember I was Google has a programming language, we call it Go. And we had a big conference in Denver. And I was one of the keynote speakers, and then I was one of the MCs. And I remember I'm so used to being the only person who looks like me, even when there's multiple thousands of people there. And maybe there was one other Black person. Actually, there was. During the after party, I remember walking up to, where all the speakers and people from the conference were mingle. And there was one of those circles that I described earlier. And I remember walking up to that circle, and there's a guy, his name is Brian Lyles. I'm 5'9", Brian is like 6'2", 6'3". But we have the same haircut, we have the same complexion. And there was a group of people standing around him, and they were so engaged in dialogue. And I remember Brian looked at me, he said, "Hi, Kelsey." And everyone turned around and super shocked, because this whole time they assumed he was me, because they were also not used to other people at the conference that looked like me. But one thing happened many years later, 3 or 4 years later, something amazing happened. And it's so funny. The reason why I remember it, the movie The Black Panthers came out, the Marvel movie. And that GopherCon, there were like 80 plus people who looked like me. And we didn't coordinate. We didn't have a special meeting beforehand and say we're all going to the same event. It turns out all of that representation on the screen, the YouTube videos, it gave other people the courage to come to the event because they belong. And there were other groups like Go Bridge, a women's group, who also created a safe space for women to show up. But I remember we were walking around, and not only were they there, many of them were speakers. And they said, "Hey, how about at lunch, we all go take a photo?" And I'm thinking maybe it will be 10 of us. And it's like 50 plus 60 of us in this photo. And I remember when they snapped it, it looked like one of those Avenger movies where the Black Panther were all there in their costume looking like superheroes. So that's how you do it. We got to show up, we got to participate. And I get it. It's a lot of baggage to carry, but someone's got to break through. And so I think we can do it.
I like the superhero metaphor. That's a very good response. An audience member mentioned that they really liked the running analogy that you set up, and they were wondering, are you a runner yourself?
No, I'm not a runner, but I play a lot of sports, and I ran track in high school, so I guess maybe that counts. But once we go over 400 meters, I'm done. This whole marathon thing, that's a little too far. But the thing about the marathon thing that I think is so appealing is that we always feel that we're running alone. And I like the fact that the world's best marathon runner recruited the help of his fellow peers to do something that they could never do on their own. So that's why I used it.
All right, and then I think the final question for tonight is, what advice would you give to students who are just starting their journey into the tech industry?
You're just starting. Own that part. It's okay. Enjoy a lot of what comes into just learning. You're going to get excited about the smallest things and embrace that, because I still try to find a way to get excited about the smallest things. When I first started programming, while a lot of people you look at, they seem to know everything. But I remember when I wrote my first for loop, 4x and do this thing. And when you're staring at code like that, right, there's a lot of logic that's happening. There's a lot of gaps that the computer will actually fill in once it's compiled. But I remember just mentally being stuck, like, how is this going to work? All I'm saying is for and blah, 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 and I don't see the rest of it. and then you run it and it works. But the thing is, that's not enough for you. You want to know why it works. Like, how the hell is the computer able to decipher from this little snippet of syntax that I really want to do that? And I remember I started by copying and pasting something else, right? You say this should work, you copy, you paste it. And I remember having this phrase like, good developers copy, great developers paste. And when you paste it, you run it and you don't know why. But here's the thing, you're going to figure out why, and it's going to click for you. And you're going to start from a clean slate. You're going to write your own for loop, and it's going to work. And you're going to feel some kind of way about it. You're going to feel amazing. That's part of the learning. When that part goes away, this job can become super boring. It's a hint you're probably at that burnout stage, because this is a wonderful, wonderful career to embark on. But you got to leave room for learning. You got to leave room for the struggle, and you got to leave room for that celebration. So if you're just starting out, that is part of the process. You're going to be new at something for the rest of your career. So embrace it, because now you're learning how to be a software engineer.
Fantastic. Well, that's the presentation for tonight. Mr. Kelsey Hightower, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. It was wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.